Hello everyone, in this section, we will talk about tables and common table configurations. In Find BI, there are three types of tables: group table, cross table, and detail table. When we switch from the data interface to the component interface, we can see that the first one by default is the group table. As the name suggests, a group table is used to group the indicator values by a specific dimension. It serves as the starting point for all other chart analyses. Here, I have dragged in date, commodity category, and sales. As you can see, it automatically generates a group table. You may notice that the commodity category column appears to have no data. However, if you expand it, data will appear. If you want it to expand automatically by default, you can go to Component Style, and under Format, there is an option for Display Row Header Nodes. The default is collapsed, so you can switch it to Expand. In addition to expansion, another commonly used feature is pagination row count. Sometimes, the data is large, and we want to display all the data on one page. In this case, we can adjust the pagination row count, and you'll see that the number of items displayed per page increases. After generating a group table, you can see the sales amounts for different dates, such as year, month, and day, and commodity categories. If you want to reduce the granularity of the date, for example, only focus on the sales amount for the year or monthly sales, you can adjust the date dimension to change the grouping granularity. Similarly, the commodity category is a text field that is grouped by identical values by default. However, you can also create custom groups, such as merging certain categories into a broader category. Next, let's look at the sales, which is the indicator here. The default aggregation method for indicators is sum. Of course, you can change this to other options such as max, min, or average. The second useful and commonly used feature in the indicator settings is quick calculation. This allows you to perform calculations without writing formulas. You can directly select the type of calculation you want to apply. For example, I can choose month-on-month growth rate and drag in the sales. A point to note is that for any calculation related to growth, like month-on-month or year-on-year, the dimension must contain a time field. Moreover, there are other quick calculation options such as percentage, group percentage, ranking, and cumulative value. For instance, we can select group percentage, where the sum of sales amounts for each commodity category under each group will add up to 100%. Now, you may notice that the sales field contains large numbers, and it may be hard to visually assess the size of the numbers, especially because they have decimal points. Therefore, we can adjust the number formatting by clicking the field and selecting Value Format. You can change the format to show values in thousands or millions, which will make the data easier to read. Additionally, you can also use percentage format when calculating ratios. Once you click OK, you will see that the table header now shows the units accordingly. OK, here I will drag the commodity category out and select the month-on-month growth rate for the sales. In addition to the quick settings for indicators we just discussed, another useful and commonly used feature is the data bars. After clicking this option, you can clearly see which values are positive, which are negative, and the size of the positive values. Once the data bars are activated, you can set the maximum and minimum values for the data bars, as well as the color for positive and negative values. Now, let's look at some quick settings for dimensions and indicators. You can try out the options, as they are quite easy to understand. I won't go into more detail about the smaller settings here. Next, let's look at table properties and component styles. I'll remove the data bar, and in the table properties, you can configure various display settings for the indicators in your table. You can set specific conditions to display data, adjust colors, and choose how the indicator values appear in the cells. There are many different shapes you can choose from. Also, you can rename the field in this area. For example, if I want to apply a color or shape change to the sales amount and month-on-month growth rate column, I can drag a field here to set the condition. For instance, if the month-on-month growth rate is greater than 0, it will be displayed in green. If it's less than 0, it will be displayed in red. You can quickly calculate it and set conditions accordingly. After dragging the field, you can add conditions and set the background color to green for positive values and red for negative ones. Once you've done this, you will see the result. If you want to adjust the shape as well, you can copy the field and apply similar conditions for color changes based on the value. The same approach applies to the sales amount column. Just remember 2 points. First, copy and drag the field to the column you want to adjust, and second, decide what conditions you want to set. After that, you can apply quick calculations or change the aggregation method if needed, then add and configure the conditions. This covers some of the common settings for table properties. As we saw earlier with the data bars, the purpose is to visually highlight abnormal data to draw attention. Next, let's move on to component styles. I've already talked about some of the commonly used formatting options. Another feature here is the summary row. By default, after generating the table, a total row is automatically created. You can adjust the position of this row, how it is displayed, and whether to show the group totals. If you add another dimension field, you can choose to show group-level totals. You can also adjust the table font, row height, and enable auto line break for the header or table body if the text is too long. You can adjust the row height based on the font size and amount of text. As for table styles, you have different options. By default, the first dimension will be grouped, and the cells will be merged. Alternatively, you can have a vertical format or a list format, and everything is displayed individually. There are also options for background settings and margin adjustments that you can explore. For time reasons, I won't go into these in detail, but feel free to explore these settings on your own. Okay, next, I'll talk about one of the commonly used features in chart analysis, which is sorting and filtering. First, let's look at sorting. In this scenario, I want to sort by date in descending order, meaning the most recent date should appear at the top. Then, I want to sort the sales for each date group in ascending order. How can we achieve this? If you look at the drop-down, you'll see options for ascending and descending sorting. First, we'll sort by date in descending order, so we select descending for date, and it will automatically sort by date. After that, for each date group, we want to sort the sales amount in ascending order. Here, the closest related field is the commodity category, so we choose ascending order for commodity category, which will sort based on the sales. The reason for this is that the indicators and dimensions we are using correspond one-to-one. This ensures that the sorting applies correctly. Now, let me introduce the detail table. The detail table displays data row by row. As you saw earlier, by holding down the Shift key and selecting all, we can drag all fields over. This table type is useful when we drill down into the detailed data to view each individual data point, or when we want to export the data. For the table header sorting, we can also display the data by year and month. For example, we can first sort by date in descending order, and then sort sales amount in ascending order. You'll notice that the sorting options in the detail tables drop-down are limited, and the main sorting takes place in the table header. Next, let's talk about chart sorting. In the chart, we can also sort the data. For instance, I can display the sales for each commodity category using a bar chart. If I want to sort the chart in descending order based on the sales, I can apply a descending sort on commodity category by sales. You'll notice that the values below each commodity category are sorted in descending order. This is how sorting works in various contexts, in the table header, in the detailed table, and in the chart view. Alright, this is our sorting part. Now, let's move on to filtering. For filtering, you can see a filter here. I'll only cover the basics of filtering today, some introductory concepts and usage. The filtering process involves several layers of filtering, which can get a bit complex, so we won't go into too much detail in this chart tutorial. If you're interested, you can click the Advanced Filtering button at the bottom of the PPT to access more in-depth documents on filtering. Here, we'll talk about two main types of filter: detail filter and result filter. What is detail filter? It means filtering the data in the underlying table before performing any analysis. This is similar to the filter you do in the data editor. For example, if I want to display only data for the first half of the year, I can select the year and month and only check certain months. As you can see, this will hide the data for other months. For sales, for instance, I can drag in the sales. When I do this, I'm asked whether I want to filter by detail values or aggregation values. Let's choose detail. For example, if I want to filter out sales greater than 1,000, the values will update accordingly. If I filter for sales greater than 10,000, you can see that only certain records remain. This is detail filtering, where we filter the underlying data before doing any calculations. Now, if I want to filter the aggregation values, like the sum of sales, I can drag in sales field and filter to show only those with total sales greater than 1 million in January. Here, we select sum because we're dealing with aggregation values. As you can see, this gives us a summary of each category's sales for that month. So, the key difference between detail filter and result filter is that detail filter happens before any aggregation or calculation is done, whereas result filter happens after the data has been processed and aggregated. For more advanced filtering concepts, you can explore the Advanced Filtering section for further learning. Earlier, I introduced the group table and detail table. Now, let's move on to the third type, cross table. The icon for a cross table is this one. Let me first drag in some fields and show you how it works. Right now, we have a group table layout, as you can see. The data is grouped by rows, with the date field and the commodity category displayed under each date, showing their respective indicators. It's organized horizontally. Now, if I switch to a cross table, you'll notice it doesn't look much different at first glance, but now there is an indicator name that appears. When I drag the commodity category field here, you can see the table format changes. Now, it's a grid where values are determined by both rows and columns, instead of just rows as in the group table. In this format, the table headers combine both row and column dimensions to display a value at their intersection. You can see that in the group table, we only had dimensions and indicators. Here, in the cross table, we have row dimensions, column dimensions, and the indicators. So, what are row and column dimensions? Row dimensions can be understood as grouping from top to bottom, vertically, which are displayed in rows. For example, dates are displayed one row after another. Column dimensions are groupings from left to right, horizontally, which are shown as columns. For example, daily necessities appear as columns in this format. Besides that, you may notice an indicator name field here. This is not something I've defined, but it was automatically generated when we added the component. The indicator name represents the names of the indicators, and its values change dynamically based on the indicators you drag in. For example, if I remove the gross profits margin field, the indicator name will not display gross profits margin accordingly. Now, the key characteristic of a cross table, compared to other table types, is that it's especially useful for displaying data and discovering correlations between variables. It helps condense the information into a smaller space, so we might have higher demands for its visual style. If you want to adjust the layout to fit your desired format, here are a couple of tips. First, swap the row and column dimensions. You can switch the row and column dimensions. After swapping, the layout changes. For example, if the dates were shown as rows and commodity categories as columns, swapping them will switch their positions. Second, remove the indicator name. If you don't want the indicator name to be displayed, you can drag it out of the table. This is useful if you only have one indicator and want the table to be cleaner. But if there are multiple indicators and you don't know what they represent, it's better to keep the indicator names for clarity. Third, swap the indicator name with the commodity category. You can swap the indicator name with the commodity category, which changes the focus of the table. Instead of seeing the indicators under each commodity category, you'll see each indicator's values for all commodity categories. Next, change the order of indicator names. You can adjust the order of the indicator names to better suit your needs. Finally, custom grouping for indicator names. You can also create custom groups for the indicator names. For example, you might want to group them as sales indicators and other indicators. This helps in organizing the indicators more clearly. You can continue to drag and drop more fields to further customize the table and make the data more understandable at a glance. Alright, that concludes this section. Let's summarize. In this section, we covered 3 types of table displays: group table, cross table, and detail table. Each type has its own specific use cases and characteristics. Here are their corresponding icons. Next, we talked about the attributes and settings of fields under the dimension category. For example, different types of fields have different grouping settings. We also discussed how to summarize indicators, apply quick calculations, and adjust value formats. Additionally, we learned how to enable data bars for special display. Then, we focused on table properties and component styles, including some common settings. The key points here are sorting and filtering, which are frequently used, so it's important to practice and understand them. Finally, we went over a detailed explanation of the cross table and its further extension.